Are there also Islamic scholars who oppose the death penalty for apostasy? Yes, fortunately, and I want to introduce one of them to you now. So I said there are also Islamic scholars who reject the death penalty or other penalties for leaving Islam. They often live in non-Muslim countries and are therefore under pressure to explain the Islamic laws when these do not really fit in with human rights. One of them is Professor Abdullah Saeed. He is from the Maldives and he studied in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia and Australia. He is Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Melbourne University. Abdullah Saeed wrote a book together with his brother Hassan titled Freedom of Religion, Apostasy and Islam. In it, they explained their view in detail. Unfortunately, only an extract of this book is available to me. But there is a shorter work called Islam and Belief at Home with Religious Freedom. In it, Abdullah Saeed explains why he rejects the punishment for apostasy and demands full religious freedom. Abdullah Saeed's arguments go something like this. In the Quran, it is not prescribed to kill apostates. It is only promised a terrible punishment in hell. The voluntary nature of belief, on the other hand, is often emphasized. Surah 2, verse 256 is particularly important here. It says there is no compulsion in religion. This verse is by no means abrogated, but still valid. Some verses of the Quran also seem to presuppose the natural death of the apostate. The Prophet himself never convicted anyone for apostasy. Hadiths clearly calling for the death penalty for apostates may not have been reliably transmitted. So this is the view of Professor Saeed. So let's hear Professor Saeed what he actually says. Here is an excerpt from the speech he gave in 2015 at Princeton University.
One of the very famous Quranic texts is La ikraha fid din, meaning there is no coercion in religion. This is a Quranic statement. I'm not actually making it up. It's a Quranic statement. Whichever way you translate it means there is no coercion in faith or religion. The term deen in Arabic can be interpreted faith or religion, or way for that matter. What is it saying? It is negating the very possibility of coercion. It's not saying don't coerce, it's saying it's negating.
It's not possible to do it.
Yeah,
so faith cannot be coerced, it's not faith.
Exactly, yes. That's what it is saying. But how did Muslim scholars actually interpret this very text? In the development of Islamic legal and theological tradition, a large majority of Muslim scholars believe that this text is abrogated. How come? Again, I go back to the context. They thought such a text must be considered on the margins of the tradition. But for me, it's a central text. There are, I would say, literally close to 100 verses I can count from the Quran to support that very idea. If you negate it, if you abrogate it, that goes against the very idea of freedom the Quran was actually talking about in relation to the human person and in relation to religion or belief that this person should accept.
I would only be too happy to agree with Abdullah Saeed. I wish his argument would convince Muslims around the world, and especially those who are in power. Laws against apostasy would be abolished, and people who leave Islam would no longer have to fear being imprisoned, executed, or murdered. In Muslim countries, too, people would be free to profess any faith that they are convinced of. Unfortunately, we are far from that. On the one hand, I would want to hug Professor Saeed because of his commitment to human rights. On the other hand, I unfortunately cannot quite follow his way of seeing things, because there are simply too many examples in the Hadith that prescribe or describe the death penalty for apostasy if the text is taken at face value as we read it. The content of many hadith today put Islam and Muhammad in a bad light. Muslims like Professor Saeed have a difficult job. They have to make their prophet look good and explain why some things were okay back then, which are no longer appropriate today and have to be done differently now. Here are two more excerpts from the speech I mentioned earlier. I find the following statements from him very informative.
I take religious freedom as a right. I don't need to justify that. Fair bit of work has been done on that issue. I take it for granted that religious freedom is a right that we all human beings have to have and should have. My starting point in this talk is very much the universal standard we are all comfortable with. That is the standard that is given in the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are four very basic rights that are emphasized in this particular article or in its interpretation. The right to adopt a particular religion of one's choice, the right to change the religion, the right to manifest that religion, and also the right to be free from coercion in matters related to religion.
Professor Saeed says here quite clearly that he takes the human right to freedom of religion as the starting point for his considerations. And from that point of view, he tries to explain how human rights are compatible with Islam. In the same video, he also states that it is okay to debate beliefs and be critical of Islam. People like Al-Qaradawi, whom I introduced in the last two videos, have a very different starting point for their thoughts. And in any case, these are not human rights. So here are two Islamic scholars that have worked intensively on the subject, and then they come to completely contradicting results. Which one of the two is right now? I cannot tell you that, but I noticed the following. Al-Qaradawi calls for the death penalty for apostates and simply quotes the text of some hadith. Done. He doesn't need any interpretation. The text stands for itself. Professor Saeed, on the other hand, cannot leave these texts without explanations. He takes a very careful look at the hadith in question and then finds out that the text is to be understood differently and not in the way you would expect when you read it for the first time. There are three different ways of reinterpreting the text. First, Muhammad acted correctly back then when he had people executed. But today the circumstances are different and therefore we are not allowed to act in the same way. Second, the death penalty was imposed not for apostasy but for other crimes. And third, some hadiths are classified as sahih, that means authentic, but are now found to be unreliable. Professor Saeed may be wrong or right in his interpretation of these hadith. The correct interpretation of a text is only important if you take the text itself seriously. Since these hadiths were only collected and written down about 200 years after the death of Muhammad, I have doubts about their reliability anyway. But both opponents and supporters of the punishment for apostasy also have other reasons for their position that have nothing to do with the interpretation of scripture. And that's when things get really interesting. Al-Qaradawi, for example, attempts to equate apostasy with high treason. That way it's supposed to sound kind of logical, and he wants to have people executed who haven't done anything but change their beliefs and talk about it. And that supposedly does not violate human rights at all. And of course, it would be completely wrong if followers of other religions would do the same. In my last two videos in this series, I tried to summarize all of this nonsense in an understandable way. Professor Saeed, on the other hand, finds it easy to justify his position logically. The reference to human rights should weigh heavily enough. But Professor Saeed has good other reasons for his opinion. Here is an excerpt from his book, Freedom of Religion, Apostasy and Islam, page 172. In countries like Malaysia, the number of people converting to Islam is far greater than the number of Muslims who renounce Islam. Therefore, it follows that if states were to introduce apostasy laws, Muslims could be prevented from converting non-Muslims to Islam. It would be inequitable to suggest that only Muslims should have the right to proselytize. Further, forcing Muslims to adhere to their religion would categorize them as hypocrites in the eyes of the Quran. People who remain as Muslim under threat of force are unlikely to have anything beneficial to offer to Islam. Criminalizing apostasy does not address the real issue. It only gives the impression that Islam is an imposed religion. It may only succeed in offending the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the world who embrace Islam voluntarily, not by force. Therefore, a more effective and practical alternative needs to be found to prevent Muslims from renouncing Islam. It seems that, with the exception of a vocal group of militants, ultra-conservatives and some extremists, a large number of Muslims throughout the Muslim world are moving away from the notion of an enforced religion to one of the profession of a religion as a covenant between an individual and God. This is closer to the Quranic idea of non-coercion in matters of faith and religion, which was so strongly emphasized in the Quran in a variety of contexts. Unlike the pre-modern period, in which non-coercion in religion was considered to have been abrogated, the modern view that is emerging among Muslims is that non-coercion remains a fundamental principle of Islam and that Islam guarantees religion's freedom to all. End of quote. Let me summarize these and other arguments from Professor Saeed in my own words. He argues that religious freedom would indeed have positive effects on Muslims and the society in Muslim countries. Restriction of belief leads to radicalization, and that contributes to the destabilization of the state. The reputation of Islam worldwide suffers when people believe that Islam uses the death penalty as a means to restrict freedom of belief. Fear of punishment for admitting your real beliefs doesn't exactly make people honest. People are threatened with the death penalty and have to publicly profess Islam even though they reject this belief. So they are being forced to become hypocrites. Muslims proselytize and are happy when people convert to Islam. Why should you claim rights for yourself and your religion that you do not want to grant to others? It's hard to pinpoint what exactly apostasy is. Some hardliners say that somebody is guilty if he or she doesn't do the 5 daily prayers. If something like that would be implemented, a bloodbath could be expected. More quotes from Professor Saeed's book Freedom of Religion, Apostasy and Islam, page 170. Muslims from one group still accuse other groups of apostasy, heresy, and unbelief. And, since the punishment of apostasy in Islamic law is a severe one, accusation of this offense can be a powerful weapon in the hands of unscrupulous ulama or political authorities, enabling them to eliminate their theological or political opponents. That's on page 49. End quote. So that we can keep track of things, I created a small table. Professor Saeed refers to the Quran, Surah 2, verse 256. I do not know the exact position of Al-Qaradawi on this, but he obviously does not think that it is important. The hadiths which call for apostates to be executed cause Professor Saeed some difficulties. In some cases, he finds lengthy and complicated explanations for why we have to understand it differently. Al-Qaradawi, on the other hand, simply quotes the hadith and they speak for themselves. Done. Both also try to justify their attitude rationally and logically. Professor Saeed has no problem with that. He has a ton of very good reasons against the death penalty for apostasy. Al-Qaradawi, on the other hand, does not have really good logical reasons. He thinks Islam is so unstable that it can only be sustained by force. Another of his arguments makes Islam look more like the mafia than a religion. Bravo! Well done, Dr. Al-Qaradawi. Detailed information can be found in the third video in this series. In conclusion, I can only say this. If the way Professor Saeed is seeing things had prevailed among around 95% of Muslims in the world, then we would not even need to talk about this topic. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So as long as people have to fear for their life because of a personal decision and because of their view on religion, I will talk about it. Dear Muslims, I do not care whether you want to reform Islam now or if you turn away from it entirely. But you have to do something. If you have a conscience and your mind works properly, then you should work hard to abolish the death penalty for apostasy. It must finally disappear into the darkness of history, and then we never have to talk about it again.